Good morning. I'm Stevie Engelke, Director of Programs at the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's Good Lecture. The lectures in this series are intended to help Smithsonian staff keep abreast of emerging research and developments as they relate to museums as places of learning. We address everything from exhibit design to outreach in the schools. The Good Lecture Series is named after the Smithsonian's earliest proponent of museums as educational institutions. This broad definition of museums is core to the Smithsonian's mission, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Our challenge now is defining more clearly the educational role museums can take and the educational impact that they can have. The March Good Lecture considered the role of museums in informal education. We will now turn our attention to formal education with today's lecture, The Necessity of Making the Invisible Visible, the Challenges of Using Museums in Formal Education, with Dr. Robert Bain. Dr. Bain is Associate Professor of History and Social Science at the University of Michigan and a faculty affiliate and advisor to the university's Museum Studies program. His research centers on the teaching and learning of history and the social sciences and has included studies of teacher preparation as well as the design and use of discipline-specific technology in classrooms and museums. Following Dr. Bain as discussant is Marty Creel, Director of Enriched and Innovative Programs for Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. He brings a unique perspective to this discussion, having initiated and implemented an extremely successful school-museum partnership that helped shape the school district's approach to the teaching of history. We will have time for questions following these presentations, and please remember that all Good Lectures are webcast live and archived for later viewing at museumstudies.si.edu. And now Dr. Bain.
Give me a second here to get mic'd. There we go. It's a really great pleasure for me to be here. Now, I was sitting out there looking at the podium that I was about to get to and then realizing that I was going to be standing behind the Smithsonian Imperator. And what an incredible honor this is. I was thinking when I was first asked to do this of my dad, who was a kind of hack musician, loved to play piano, kind of honky-tonk jazz, and I always used to kid that the thing he always wanted to do was to play at Carnegie Hall. And to think for a historian, the equivalent to playing at Carnegie Hall must be to play at the Smithsonian. This morning, I want to invite you to think with me about teacher learning, a subject that in many ways has been the central focus of my career, my research and my work for most of my life. First as a classroom teacher. For 26 years I was a high school history teacher in the Cleveland area. I'm also a historian that am very interested in educational policies and the relationships among different professional communities. And now I'm a full-time teacher educator at the University of Michigan, and I work with and study the ways that pre-service teachers and in-service teachers take up and use what they learn in the service of education. So today I want you to join me in thinking about teacher education, particularly history teacher education, as a distinctive type of adult learning, a type of adult learning whose purpose it is to help other people learn in a formal setting. I want to give you some caveats at the outset. First, my focus is on formal education, particularly schools, and the role that teacher education, in this instance professional development, can play in improving student learning in schools. Essentially, I'm going to argue today for a different type of professional development, a different type of teacher education, one that focuses specifically on what I call the problems of teaching history. Today I'm going to argue that museums can better serve teachers by lending their expertise to mediate the challenges and problems teachers face in the context within which they work, which in this instance are formal settings. My second caveat is that I'm going to focus only today on history teachers, history students, history classrooms, and towards the end, a reconsideration of the role history museums might play in educating history teachers. While I've collaborated with colleagues across disciplines, math and science in particular, most of my work, however, has been in the area of history. And my work with museums has been exclusively in the area of history museums in the professional development of teachers. Now, this is not only a great venue for me to be speaking at, but this is a perfect time in American history to consider these issues of history teacher learning. It's a wonderful time to take up these challenges, in part because of the Teaching American History grants. How many people know about those? I had a very interesting, this has been a godsend for my field. In fact, I've often referred to it as the equivalent of the National Defense Act for historians, history teachers, and history museums. On the way here, I was at the airport in Detroit, and a math colleague of mine was coming here to another meeting. We were sitting talking, and he had never heard of the Teaching American History Grant Program at all. So it made me realize this might be a parochial institution for those of us that work in this field. Let me explain a little bit about it. Over the last 6 to 7 years, Congress, through the Department of Education, has awarded over $750 million and counting on improving the content knowledge of history teachers in order to improve student learning. Let's take a look at the legislation. This is the title of the legislation. This is the Teaching American History Grant. This is exactly what it talks about. It's a grant to support projects to raise student achievement by improving teachers' knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of traditional American history. Grant awards will assist local educational agencies, school districts, counties, etc., in partnerships with entities that have expertise, extensive content expertise, to develop, document, evaluate, and disseminate innovative and cohesive models of professional development. By helping teachers to develop a deeper understanding and appreciation of traditional American history as a separate subject within the core curriculum, these programs improve instruction and raise student achievement. Now, as Alex Stein, who was the directing of this program for the Department of Education, wrote when it first came out in 2003, quote, "This is a bold new idea that history content could be delivered directly to United States history teachers through ongoing partnerships with providers of history expertise." And by the way, one of those central providers of history expertise, one of the major providers, are museums across the country. Now, all across the country, over the last 6 or 7 years, Teaching American History grants have stimulated new initiatives in history teacher education. And museums across the country, along with universities, have been at the very forefront of these programs and helping to educate teachers. To its credit, this $750 million, by the way, this is the largest single investment in history teacher education in the history of the Republic, totally. If you added up everything that's been spent, it doesn't come even close to what's been spent in the Teaching American History grants. Now, this has already yielded some very bold results. First, it's played a significant part in keeping history on the school agenda at a time when reading and math seems to be pushing it off. Second, the Teaching American History grant programs have created incentives, fiscal and professional, for historians, history teachers, history educators, museums, and museum educators to work together. And we're going to learn more of the positive results of this later today from Marty's conversations. This grant program has re-energized an interest in teaching by the historical profession and in the education of history teachers, K-16. And it's provided a powerful, very powerful incentive and opportunity to link established institutions like the Smithsonian or like the Henry Ford in my part of the country to teachers and schools. Now, I would argue its greatest benefit thus far has been indeed these interactions, the connections, the links, and the new initiatives that it seems to be spawning. As Alex in many ways was right, this is bold and exciting. However, I have a very great concern about the assumptions that fuel the Teaching American History grant and that I suspect shape much of the interactions between teachers and those with content expertise. Let me highlight the assumptions I'm concerned about. So this is what the grant is really focusing on. Its goal is to raise student achievement, but it's to do it by improving teachers' content knowledge, understanding and appreciation of traditional American history. By helping teachers develop a deeper understanding and appreciation of traditional American history, these programs will improve instruction and raise student achievement. Now, underlying both the legislation and most of our attempts to construct professional development in history and education are these sets of assumptions and practices, what David Tyack and Larry Cuban in another setting have called the very deep grammar of the way that we work as educators trying to improve instruction. That is, we seek to increase teachers' content knowledge as a way to improve student learning. Such education, such attempts to improve teachers' content knowledge often does two very important things. It separates content from pedagogy, compartmentalizing one from the other, and it halts its work at the classroom door. For over 75 years, this compartmentalized work, one that separates content and pedagogy and assessment of student thinking, placing these on different sides of campus, in different settings, in different parts of the day, has shaped the ways in which we've educated American teachers, both pre-service and while they're in the classroom. Let me give you a picture of this. Most common professional developments look something like this, and this tends to be the way that most of the bulk of the money is being spent. That if your goal is to increase student achievement by increasing teachers' content knowledge, what do? You increase inputs. What kinds of inputs? Well, you add content knowledge to the teacher, typically during the summer when they can spend some time to do the work. You add lesson plans separate from the content knowledge, or you add resources. Let me give you a better picture of this. This is the typical look of professional development, the way it's evolved over American history. That what we have is we have something to do, we do something to improve teachers' content knowledge, or we do something to improve teachers' historical reasoning. So for example, all across the country during the summers we have institutes, 2 3-week institutes. Historians, museum curators come and they work with teachers. They increase teachers' content knowledge about specific content, the Civil War, Reconstruction, or they work on historical reasoning, working with primary sources. Now, some of these stop right there. Others of them work on pedagogy. So typically, the historical expert comes in, delivers content in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we add lesson plans to the mix, or we develop and provide instructional materials. We work on resources. Now, where this stops is at the classroom door. What do we do the following summer? We bring in new content experts, new resources, new materials, develop new lessons. We never follow the professional development, or rarely, into the context within which teachers actually work. And in a weird sort of way, what we do is we give teachers the various puzzle parts that are enacted in the classroom, but we leave it to them to figure out how to actually do it, how to actually modify it. It's sort of like analogous to teaching engineers about materials, physics, geography, but never hanging around long enough to find out if they can build a bridge. While focusing on teacher knowledge and even on helping teachers write lesson plans, this type of professional development essentially ignores the context within which teachers must do their history teaching. That is, classrooms, with students, and heaps of demands. This is what I want to call into question today, and this is what I want to spend my time focusing on. In making my argument today, I'm going to draw upon efforts that I've spent over the course of a career to understand and to uncover the logic or the thinking embedded in history teaching. A logic related but different than the logic of doing history the way historians do it. As I'm going to argue briefly towards the end, the kind of thinking that a teacher does in their classroom might be more aligned to the type of history that curators and exhibit designers do when they're thinking about design for the public. My work suggests that history teaching demands a type of reasoning that, while grounded in practice and epistemology, is nonetheless distinctive from the kinds of thinking that historians do. In short, it's because the problems of utility that history teachers face are distinctively different than the problems of utility that a historian faces. Let me sum it up this way. Often we hear that we're trying to get teachers to think more like historians, or in the science field, more like science. What I want to argue today is that while that may be necessary, it is hardly sufficient if the goal is to improve student learning. What I want to do today is to take seriously, then, the thinking that history teachers do in the place that they stand. A place, by the way, that I stood for 26 years inside the history classroom. And to urge a professional development model that takes seriously the intellectual problems that teachers of history face as teachers of history. Problems that demand they think like history teachers, using history and other disciplines and experiences to reason about and to act on the problems of their practice, the practice of improving the quality of student understanding. Now I'm going to do what historians often do. I'm going to tell some stories, some historical stories, to illuminate simply 2 points. The first point is that teaching is a thinking practice that takes place in and is tied to a very complex setting. Thinking practices, as Stephen Toulmin argued a very long time ago, involve posing and solving problems, asking and answering questions in action. For example, how to best approach this content for those learners? How do I know they are learning? How slow should I go? How fast should I go? What should come next? What do I follow back on? What do I foreshadow? What do I retreat back to? How do I choose which sources to use? As many have argued, to understand the thinking practice and its logic, it's sensible to look carefully and fully at the problems, the intellectual problems that are embedded in practice. Dewey and Toulmin have reminded us that there's a special kind of logic related to problem solving embedded in context. Thus, I'm going to argue that history teaching is a distinctive thinking practice with its own distinctive logic. While related to, it's not the same type of thinking that historians employ in doing history. And while related, it's not the same thinking as other teachers do, like math teachers or biology teachers, or even government or psychology teachers do. Let me give you just a quick example of this. I have a PhD in history, and I worked on primary sources. The time I was working on my PhD in history, I was also teaching full-time in Cleveland. I was teaching 6 classes a day, some of them history classes. I would go to the archives in the evening, and I would pull out the primary sources that I was working on to write my dissertation. And then at night, later in the evening, I would lock up the archive and go and teach my classes. The next day, I would return to the same archive, open up the primary sources. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about the reading of those primary sources. While it was challenging and difficult to do that work as a historian, the sources didn't change in the 24 hours from the time that I last looked at them. They were still there, interestingly enough, laid out in exactly the same fashion that I had laid them out before, and I read them one at a time. That was never true of my classroom. The students that I left in one day, I came back, and they had changed. In some ways, changed dramatically. Bill, who I thought understood something, all of a sudden the next day had lost that understanding. Ellen, who I thought didn't get it, somehow got it. Plus, I was constantly reading multiple primary sources, in this instance, my students, simultaneously. The argument that I want to make in some ways is that the reading of student thinking is much more difficult than the reading of primary sources, which took me 7 years of graduate school until someone said that I had sufficiently mastered them. So in the first part of the talk today, I'm going to try to surface the types of problems that history teachers face. That is to make visible their problems. Embedded in this argument is that if we want to be successful in professional development, what we want to do is take seriously the problems that the teachers face in the context within which they work. And then our professional development should help them manage those problems. By the way, when I refer to the word problem, I don't mean little Billy sitting in the corner that's driving me crazy. I refer to the intellectual problems that are embedded in a practice, the challenges that are enduring, that as thinkers we have to face constantly. You know, if one comes to graduate school to work on a doctorate, a student might spend 3 or 4 years defining their intellectual problem that they're going to work on. It is an enduring problem of which they'll make some contribution. I mean, there are some historians who've been working on the same problem 20 or 30 years of their lives, and it's not because they're slow learners. It's because the problem is sufficiently engaging, that they keep, in a sense, getting some leverage on it. Well, that's the argument. When I use the word problem about teaching, that's exactly what I mean. Take the problem of pacing. That is an enduring problem, one that, for example, I can see right away I'm going to be facing in this morning's lecture. My second point is that we might learn from other fields. And if I had a little bit more time, I would argue that we could actually learn from the earliest history of formal teacher education if we seek to reconstruct professional development by putting the teaching problems central to the work that we do. Here, I want to make a case that suggests that we need a different type of professional development, way more than lesson planning or giving a lecture on history or discussions of historiography, but something that's actually going to work with teachers about the problems of practice that they face. In a sense, the vision that I have here is to view the classroom as a studio within which the teacher works. And in a sense, what we would be doing, those of us who work in professional development, would be conducting a master's class, the way one would do in music, where one works with someone in the context with which they work. I mean, imagine a master's class in music that never really watched the musician actually perform the thing that they were training. It would be ludicrous. A better model of this, or maybe the one my favorite, and we had a little technical problem with this. I was going to show you a little clip of this. How many people know the Actors Studio? Well, good. Let me describe it just briefly. I had a little clip and we had some technology problems. To me, this strikes me as the classic model of professional development that's working on a problem. In it, that gentleman, James Lipton, who is the dean of the Actors Studio in New York, invites in a famous director or actor or playwright and interrogates them about their craft. They do it for the benefit of prospective actors, prospective directors, prospective playwrights. So, for example, in the clip that I was going to show you, wish I could act it out a bit. Ray Fiennes is talking about his role in Schindler's List, and Lipton says to him, "How did you play that character? How did you do research on the character? Why did you put on the weight? How did you get that paunch that you did? What did Spielberg do? How did Spielberg get that?" Fiennes says, Spielberg likes to work quickly, and this is what he does, and this is the benefit of working quickly. Now, it's fascinating for those of us that are interested in acting and directing. Fascinating because you cannot see what Ray Fiennes does when he's acting if he's as good as he is, because he's made it part of his practice so deeply that the edges are taken out of it. In other words, the expertise is so evident that if I want to study how he did it, it's very difficult to do. Another example of the same thing is a very famous movie where Picasso actually, I don't know if people have ever seen it, he actually paints on the movie screen. So you can see what Picasso does, why he takes a brush stroke off, how he backs forward and goes back and forth. In a sense, that's the model that I want to suggest for professional development. That if what we're doing is we're leaving the teacher at the very place where they have to act, we've left them in the lurch. We haven't shown or helped the teacher consider the very places that they need to work. So today I want to explore this metaphor a bit, working together with educators to improve teaching and learning. Now, I'm going to tell some stories, and in a sense that it's around two different things. First, I want to frame some of the problems of teaching practice. I'm going to use my own biography as a teacher of high school history for over 25 years, in a sense as a student of teaching and learning, my own trajectory of learning, if you will. Secondly, I'm going to talk briefly about some work that we've done at the University of Michigan with the Henry Ford, an outstanding museum in Dearborn. And I'm going to offer some ways that we've engaged in a James Lipton type engagement with history teachers, where we unpacked, in a sense, what curators were doing in the design of museum exhibits for the benefit of pedagogy. In fact, later on this afternoon, we'll talk a little bit more about the virtual curator. Now, I should add that this is not just an exercise in imagination, an exercise without evidence, or an exercise without purpose. Whenever I say I'm a history teacher, I always add that I'm a student of history teaching and learning. In less modest moments, I even say I'm a scholar of history teaching and learning. For example, the last 12 years of my classroom teaching, I did much more than just teach. I also systematically studied my teaching to improve it. I looked carefully at what was going on in that classroom. Now, how did a practicing history teacher, trained as a historian, study their teaching? Well, I began treating my classroom as a historical event. Like all historic events, it happens one time and then it disappears. And then it immediately becomes past. For my students, sometimes I wasn't even convinced it happened the first time for them. It disappears totally from sight. And then, like any historian, the only way we can study that event is that it had to have left residues in the past, in the present. To understand, therefore, I had to leave or study the residues, the documents of the classroom. So, for example, we started to keep documents of what was going on in class, videotapes, audio tapes, journals of the students. And like any good historian, I was using documents and records of the past to keep the past from fading when memory fades. And when memory seeks to change the past, as it surely does, then those documents and records can help provide a public check on personal and public memory. So it is with the classroom. By keeping records and artifacts of our teaching and of student learning, it's possible to go back then and analyze what happens in a classroom to make it visible again to myself and to others. This is work, by the way, that we continue to do in all the professional development activities. So we treat our professional development activities and the classrooms that our teachers work in as historical events worthy of documenting so we can understand the impact that it has, in a sense of making that visible. So what are the problems of teaching history? What exactly are the challenges that teachers face? Without understanding those, it's very difficult to design much of a professional development, I would argue. Now, as a history teacher, I faced a very unique set of challenges and at times very conflicting expectations. These expectations and challenges created serious intellectual problems for me. In fact, these challenges and these competing expectations define the very context within which I worked, a context quite different from the library and quite different from the archive. First, there was the expectation that I covered prescribed content and make meaning out of historical knowledge that arrives in meaningless lists or in textbooks. Now, while historians typically begin with a puzzle, a problem, a question for investigation, history teachers begin with the answers in the form of content that others demand that we must teach and our students must learn. In any case, the state of Ohio, where I was teaching, and the school district that I worked for, provided lists of names, dates, and events, historical stuff that I was to cover. It was filled with lists of important things like how democracy was established. And it's not to say that I disagreed with any of those things that were on the list. It is to say, however, these were not my choices. They arrived at the door in the form of list mandated by the state or mandated by my district. Further, that list, broken up one thing after another, only got longer and wider each year as the school and the state expected me to teach the students more facts, more names, and more events. Now, while feeling crunched by this rising expectation, I frankly also agreed with it. First, there was simply more history to teach every year. I mean, I began teaching world history in 1972 when the Vietnam War was still waging, and I was teaching it up through 1998, a decade after the Berlin Wall came down. I mean, consider the importance of that quarter of a century in world history. Consider all the things that happened just in the 25 years from the time that I started teaching that I couldn't have taught, but I had to teach at the end of it. Things that we wanted to know that our students needed to know. By the way, even if nothing important had happened between 1972 and 1998, the history curriculum still would have expanded. Because the last generation or so, this profession has recognized that the curriculum had been ignoring or treating superficially many vital aspects of history. As a teacher active in history education, I often sat at the policy table and I expressed my concerns about what was or was not included in the history curriculum. As a concerned citizen and a historian, I often urge that we add more historical events and more historical movements to that curricular list, more information about women, more information about laborers, more information about African Americans, more information about social class. However, as a high school history teacher, expanding the content of my courses complicated an already complicated task of teaching history to adolescents. My state, my school, my principal, the parents of my students, my colleagues, and even the students expected me to cover more factual material. Frankly, I felt squeezed. The list of what I had to teach only got longer, but the school year stayed the same. Actually, the school year got shorter because my state, like all states during this time period, was adopting testing. And so we lost 5, 6, 7, 8 days a year to testing. Now, this is a very distinctive problem that history teachers face. How to make meaning out of this mess. How to put meaning over sheer memory. How to connect students across all this historical time. But let me add something else. It's not just historical time. That a teacher lives in school time, as do the students. So it's not just connecting the Civil War to Reconstruction. It's connecting Monday to Tuesday, Tuesday in September to Tuesday in April. Sometimes it's connecting what happened at the beginning of the period to the end. Second, not only did the state and the parents expect that as a teacher I was going to help my students understand these facts, they also demanded that I help them learn to think better. No one expected me to teach only the facts. Everyone expected that students would also improve their capacity to think. The prescribed curriculum also included lists of thinking skills or historical habits of mind or those things teaching for deep understanding. By the way, I fully agreed with that. Even as a beginning teacher, I thought that the central purpose of history education was to help students become more adept at locating and weighing evidence, using evidence to make a case, modifying thinking in the face of new evidence, understanding the complexity of cause and effect in human affairs, spotting and analyzing propaganda, using analogy well while identifying bad or weak analogies. By the way, the standardized tests in the state that I worked in not only had multiple choice questions, but also tried using a DBQ, document-based question, to assess students' historical thinking. So they expected me to teach for interpretation. They expected that I would be able to master all the things that I was doing and to help my students learn to think like historians. Now, which students? I was expected to help all of my students, not just some, learn the facts, pass the test, become better thinkers, get into college, become contributing members of a democratic society. Good history teaching and learning must be for everyone. And in my teaching situation, that usually meant about 150 students that were compelled to attend my class every day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year. Now, historians often write for other historians, but that's not the case for a history teacher because my audience was not always interested, not always scholarly, and often had their own views of the past and of history. And you may find this very hard to believe. My students do not always share the same excitement for learning facts or doing historical thinking as I did. They did not see this as an opportunity to engage with the past. In fact, many saw my class as work that they were forced to do, work that I forced them to take home. Now, this meant another expectation and another problem that a teacher faced. People expected me to make my history lessons meaningful, exciting, interesting, to engage and teach all 150 of all of my students the prescribed content, the prescribed thinking skills, the prescribed dispositions from a continually growing list that arrived at my door in the form of discrete behavioral objectives or disconnected textbook chapters. Yow. Put that way, no wonder I used to go home totally exhausted at the end of the day. I mean, I always marvel at my friends who were doctors or lawyers that would talk about how complicated their life was, and I'd say, yeah, you know, I'm really pretty envious of you. And they'd say, you are? I mean, you're just a high school teacher. And I'd say, yeah, but, you know, my friend the doctor, you treat one of your cases at a time. My friend the lawyer, you try one case at a time. All my cases show up in groups of 30. Now, for those of us that are involved in professional development, it's important to remember that teachers must do their work in that situation, involving hundreds of students, hundreds of expectations, hundreds of constraints from both above and below. In considering the education, then, of history teachers, it's important to consider the context within which they must use their learned knowledge, skills, and dispositions. to remember that, like me, most of teachers must work from an already defined list of content that gets bigger every year. They must try to create lessons that would engage, interest, and instruct all their students both to think critically and to acquire the cultural knowledge defined as important by the school community, the state, and the profession. Obviously, history teaching amidst such expectations was and continues to be quite complicated. And it's certainly different than the context within which historians work as historians or other teachers as teachers work. Now, how is it that history teachers, particularly new teachers or even veteran teachers, learn to work in such situations? By what logic, by what strategy, by what type of education do they typically get prepared to do this work? Now, like many teachers, I started with the tools that I had acquired in my college courses and then developed over professional development. But let me tell you just a bit about that. Many people have described history teacher education in this country, in fact, most teacher education in this country, as a non-systemic system. It has competing and very loosely coupled sites where teachers can learn, develop their understandings and their teacher practices, and that was certainly my case. Like most, I had a loosely coupled or weakly organized set of educational experiences that occurred in very different settings. I took history courses from the history department, sat in the lecture hall, sat in the seminar room, went to the educational school where I got pedagogical training, and then went to the field. In professional development while teaching, the same situation repeated itself. I got content knowledge from experts. I got some pedagogical skills from people that were going to work on, lesson planning, and the knowledge that came out of the field was handled by colleagues and not necessarily by anyone that was coming in and working on what was going on inside the classroom. In short, there were different people doing different things at different times of the day. It was fragmented. I'll tell you an interesting story. Not too long ago, it was a byproduct of the Teaching American History grants. I attended, was pleased to give a keynote talk at a really wonderful conference at the University of Wisconsin. And in the conference, they decided they used Teaching American History grant money to bring together the people that were participating in preparing teachers. So they invited historians, they invited in museum educators, they invited in the people from the School of Education. I approached this as if it was like almost a family reunion of sorts, even though I had not graduated from there. I have a PhD in history. My appointment is in the School of Education at the University of Michigan. I taught for 26 years. I have a degree, one master's in curriculum, another master's in history. I thought this is like my family gathering until I realized it was a dysfunctional family gathering because it was the first time these people, all charged with the task of educating teachers, sat in the same room. I was introducing them to each other, yet they were on the same campus. Now, sometimes when this works, it often is what I would call an additive model, meaning we take something, content knowledge, and then we add pedagogy to it. Now, this is true, for example, at most teacher training programs throughout the country. First, you get your content. You get your bachelor's degree in the state of California in history or science or something like that. Then we add pedagogy. At times, it's so compartmentalized that it's not seen as additive. In fact, sometimes there's disdain cast between the people that are responsible for training teachers. So, for example, those with content knowledge put disdain on those that are working on pedagogy. I often think that colleagues think that those of us that work in a school of education are teaching people how to make bulletin boards and not other kinds of things. But the reverse is equally true. People who work with pedagogy say all they're doing is content knowledge. They don't care about much else. Think about that for a second. This kind of compartmentalization fragments the very things that teachers must do, and probably the most amazing thing is that the professional development and the training leaves out an absolutely critical and central figure in professional development, the kids. Very little professional development actually looks at the impact of professional development on the people it's aimed for, improving the quality of the lives of the children. Most times, professional development occurs in the luxury of the summer when people have time. Rarely do we follow the people in the professional development into the classrooms. Rarely do we revisit what they had learned to see what impact it had on teachers, on the students. By the way, this model is sufficiently true. It's also one of the great criticisms that have come from the Teaching American History grants. And in fact, in the first review at the end of the second year, something like 75% of the grants never followed the teachers back into the classroom. If they did anything, they had some kind of book discussion during the school year. I want you to think about that for a second. That would be like someone designing professional development for doctors and never asking whether the surgical techniques we teach them actually save lives. Now, such was the situation in the sense that I would argue has dominated teacher education for an awful long period of time. Where does one go for help? Where does one go to deal with the problems that I just articulated, those problems of coherence, those problems of pacing, the problems of multiple students? These are very difficult challenges. How does one build coherence? How do you support the work of students? How do you see what students are thinking? Well, I want to talk for a second or two about a slightly different model, about, in a sense, my own personal trajectory. I turn to experts, not for their expertise in their area, but for their expertise about my teaching problems. Figuratively, I invited historians to say, I got a problem in my classroom. I'm not as interested in you giving me over content knowledge. Help me grapple with the problem. Now, what problem? Well, let's take coherence as a problem that a teacher and students face in the classroom. And let's take coherence as an interesting set of expertise that historical scholars have. How is it that historians, or how is it that museum curators take discrete, separate, individualistic objects and weave them together into some coherent monograph or some coherent exhibit? What is it that makes coherence in that domain? How is it that in an exhibit, the exhibitor foreshadows something that's going to come a little later on in the exhibit? How is it that a historian gives me some kind of clue as to what I'll be looking at? Well, in professional development work, my own first personal, and then the work we've been doing with teachers across the country, that's why we've turned to historians and to museum curators. Not just simply to give over expertise, not to train in professional, in reading primary sources, though that's certainly one of the things that we're very interested in, but rather, what expertise do you bring that can help solve our problems? In other words, we start with the teacher's problems. So for example, let me give you just a couple of examples. In work that we've been doing with teachers across the country, we've looked at this very interesting question. How is it that a historian takes a monograph and builds coherence? And we discovered that historians often use problems, a large central question. So for example, Joe Ellis, in a lovely book about Washington, a new book about President Washington, starts by asking this very interesting question. Why do we need another book about George Washington? He says, we really don't. But he says, I got to tell you something. He says, I looked at Jefferson, and Jefferson, as bright a human being as existed in that generation, he looked up to Washington. Franklin, as clever a man, he looked up to Washington. Adams, as politic a man, he looked up to Washington. And Ellis concludes that Washington was the foundingest father of them all. Why was that? And hence, that problem hooks me to read Ellis's book. More importantly, it connects chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3 to chapter 4. Fascinating thing about questions in the context of a classroom. They rarely used to drive instruction. They're often used to figure out what someone knows after they've learned. When do questions appear in the textbook? At the end. When do we give the kids the questions? On the test at the end. So, one of the things we've been working on in professional development is, can we take good driving historical problems to organize and coordinate instruction over long periods of time? So for example, in work that we did in the Henry Ford, we took up the question of migration patterns. Henry Ford has a terrific collection of immigrants immigrant data. There was a Ford Motor Company had a sociology section that was dealing with Americanization. And so we were going to use the objects that were on the grounds of the Henry Ford, and we, with the curators, asked ourselves, if you've got these objects, what's the question? In other words, we played a sort of historical Jeopardy. There's the answer. What's the question? And so what we did was we designed a curriculum using museum objects that organized huge amounts of kids in the Detroit curriculum around this question. Why would anyone move to Detroit? When would they move there? Why would they move there? What adjustments would they have to make? What inquiries would we have to do? Drove tremendous parts of the curriculum. Give you another one. What kinds of questions do we ask in exhibits? What kinds of questions do historians ask in their books? R.G. Collingwood, in a lovely book called The Idea of History, poses this very interesting question. He says, what we should ask is, what were they thinking, to make visible the thinking that a historical actor asks. A marvelous thing. Instead of saying, why did this occur, ask, what were the actors thinking? Now, by the way, most curators understand that, don't they? Because part of what goes on in an exhibit is an attempt at what we often call historical empathy. This attempt to get us, particularly in a historical museum, to understand the way that people saw the world. What were they thinking? How do we know they thought that? That question often is embedded in the exhibit itself. It isn't necessarily made visible. It's a byproduct of a good exhibit. In fact, it's in some ways in the mind of the exhibitor. The other exhibitors will see it. Both the teacher and the student may not necessarily see it. In other words, what we've begun to do is to take the problem that a teacher faces in coherence and take experts to come to bear on those. Let's take another one. We've turned to cognitive psychologists. There are a group of people that have been studying the ways in which people think when they interact with history, particularly students. Now, those of you in the museum world know this is visitor studies. In a sense, we've been doing the same kinds of things in schools. Let me give you just one simple example of this. In a seminal study, Sam Weinberg in 1989, as part of his doctoral dissertation, posed this very interesting question. Weinberg said, you know what? All across the country, people are using primary sources, or at least claiming to. In fact, professional development going back to at least the mid-'60s was trying to get more and more teachers to use more and more primary sources. In fact, some might argue that the use of primary sources in a history classroom is the analog to the lab in the science classroom, right? It's kind of the hands-on experience. We'll give primary sources or primary objects and have the kids work on those sets of things. I was certainly doing this. That's what I did in my classroom from very early on. Weinberg did a very interesting study. He asked this question. Just because a student can mimic the behavior or represent the behavior, does it mean that they're actually doing the kind of thinking that's embedded in that kind of behavior? So he conducted a marvelous experiment. He found a handful, 9 high school students, juniors I think, in the Palo Alto area, all of them bright kids. All of them had taken advanced placement or honors history. All of them had passed a multiple choice test to show that in point of fact they knew history, knew historical facts. All had studied primary sources. He also matched these students up with 9 or 11 historians. He simply asked them to read primary sources out loud. The document set that he picked came from a study by Richard Brown called the Amherst Study, where it was really around the Lexington-Concord battle. Who fired the first shot? There were 11 or 12 documents. What the kids did was they read the documents and talked out loud as they were reading them. They were called think-alouds, each kid on their own. Same thing with the historians. Now, what's interesting about this study is that some of the historians did not know, in fact, many of them did not know as much about the American Revolution as the kids did. For example, there were some historians of Japan that knew very little about the event. The kids actually did better in the multiple choice test. What did Weinberg find when he looked across the way the experts were reading and the ways in which these expert kids, again, I want to underscore, these kids were really quite good students. What he found was this, that the historians, one of the first things they did was they took the documents and put them in chronological order. The second thing they did was when reading the document, the first thing they read was who wrote it and when it was written, no matter where that appeared on the document. In other words, they would take a document and they'd say, I wonder who wrote this, and they'd turn it over to find the attribution. Most amazing when you read the transcripts was the fact that the documents ended up in a dialogue in the mind of the historian. So the historian would read one document, and then she would start to read the second and say, what's going on here? These themes don't seem to agree. Well, this kind of does. I wonder why. Let's take a look at a third. When you read the transcript, it almost sounds like there are multiple voices in the room because there's a conversation between texts. How did these kids read the documents? Well, they read them in the order in which they were given. They read attribution only if that was first. They never went looking for it. They never looked to who wrote it, and they never even raised much of a question as to who wrote it. Finally, they did not corroborate sources, but in point of fact, trusted the source that was the most authoritative. Now, I got to tell you a story. I read that article in 1989 as a classroom teacher. I sat there in stunned disbelief because, heck, I knew my students were doing better than that. I gave them the handout that said you ask questions about who wrote this and when they wrote it, and I know I gave that handout at the beginning of the school year. I knew doggone they could do it. And then I did a think aloud with my students. It was devastating. They read the primary sources the way they were reading the textbook, gutting it for information. When I came to that recognition, I thought, either I give up or I might as well be assigning the textbook, because that's essentially what they were doing. In other words, the work of the cognitive psychologist got me to begin to ask questions about the ways my students were thinking, and using that to help me think about what I was doing in my classroom. In other words, making visible what the audience is doing is critical if I'm going to improve their learning. Let me give you the third one, sociocultural theorist. Here again, I was learning to see my classroom through the eyes of another expert, asking, okay, so if there's this gap between novices and experts, how do I bridge it? Sociocultural theorists, here I'm talking about people like Vygotsky, or in literacy theory, Anne-Marie Palinsar, people who say, look, we use tools to think with. All of us do. Our language is a tool. We use signs to think with. The best example of a tool I can give is my cell phone. There was once upon a time I actually knew 20, 30, 50 phone numbers. Right? Today I know 3. My office number, my home number, before I lied, my cell number, my wife's cell number. I don't know my kid's cell number. I shouldn't admit that But with the cell phone, I know thousands. It's a tool that, in fact, enhances my memory. What tools can I instantiate in my classroom that will enable my kids to think better than they could without them? That question can only be asked in action. I can puzzle over it. I can empirically I can puzzle over it and design some things, but it must be empirically tested, because either the tool will work or it won't. Let me give you another example of this ideal tool, and I'm going to actually give you one in a second, and then move very quickly, because of the time, to the work that we did with the Henry Ford around these exact same sets of issues. In the chemistry classroom, the periodic table sits in the classroom, and the good chemistry teacher, at least I had a very good one, taught me how to read it and use it, not memorize it. Because of the periodic table, I could do things in chemistry that I couldn't do without. Well, the same thing is true in history. What kinds of tools does the audience need, do the students need, in order to do more sophisticated work? By the way, this is another good example. I hope you can see the way we've been going with this in terms of our work with museum designers. What supports does the museum designer put into the exhibit that enables people to do things they wouldn't be able to do without it? What are the tools? What's the language? What's the pointers? What's the director? What's the narrative that goes back over it? Why that narrative over another? Let me give you just one minor example of this. In some work that we've documented a lot, we've taken this very interesting problem of the fact that kids often have a very difficult time of determining what makes something significant historically. They often think, lots of research on this, Terry Epstein's done a lovely study of this, Most kids think something is significant if it meets two criteria. One, some authority says it's significant. The museum puts it on display, it's in the textbook, the teacher says it's on the test. Or it strikes their personal interest. Now, if what you're trying to do is to get kids to really think, those two things are not the very best thing to do, right? How do you get a kid who's lived 15, 16, 18 years of their life doing quite well by simply letting an authority tell them whether something is significant or not, or trusting in their own personal experiences? We tried a very interesting experiment that's done, we've done it in a variety of different places in a variety of different settings. We've asked kids to simply come in the first or second day of school with things that they would put into a time capsule. We asked them to make a list of 10 items. Then when they get into class, we asked them to look over their list and rank them from 1 to 10. After we rank them, we ask them to draw a line under number 3. Then the kids argue and debate over, what should go in it. We don't care a whit about what they actually put in, because right towards the end of the class, we do this. Here's what we're very interested in. How did you make the decision? What to include and what not? We ask them to go metacognitive. What decisions did you make between 3 and 4? How come 9 isn't 3? Then we externalize what kids say, and we create our own periodic table called Tools for Determining Significance. There's a list. It affects human beings, it lasts long periods of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then we force the kids to use that to do all kinds of things. We ask them to read the textbook. After you read the first chapter, tell us. Analyze the textbook to decide whether or not you think the author made a good decision about what to include. Now the kid says, well, come on, I'm 14 years old. They're the authority. That book weighs 40 pounds. I barely weigh 40 pounds. Use your tools and use your argument to weigh the author. In a sense, what we've done is create peer status. Well, in our work with museums, this is the kind of work we've begun to do more and more and more. We've begun to say, look, here are the problems the teacher faces. There's the problems of getting people to remember things. There's the problem of coherence. There's the problem of narrative flow. There's the problem of juxtaposition. In fact, let me give you exactly the questions that we've begun to pose with museum people. How do you use space to build coherence? Now, in the museum, it's both temporal and physical space, isn't it? We ask the same thing, how can I learn from, I'm a classroom teacher. I've got the same problem you've got. I've got temporal and physical space too. The temporal space I've got is broken up over days. Unfortunately, that's probably not your situation. In our work with the Henry Ford in Detroit, we found that more often than not, in fact, we call them the one-shots, one-shot question, because the student often visited the museum once on a field trip and didn't necessarily come back. The teacher's going to get them the next day, but the problem is similar. How do you organize space? How do you organize time? How do you organize content? What are the juxtapositions you use? What would happen if you put things differently? I went to the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Venice and was stunned by the juxtapositions, that if you walk from one thing to another, that you get a very different experience than if you walk the museum the different direction. What can I learn from you as museum educators, as designers, about juxtaposition that would support me in the work that I do in the classroom? What are they seeing? What are the students actually seeing? The question that Weinberg poses. What's going on in their minds? What's going on in the mind of the audience? How do we know it? Well, let me very quickly talk, by way of concluding, just very quickly some of the work that we did with the museums in Detroit in a little bit of a trajectory. First thing, this was part of a project that was 6 years long, and it was we called ourselves the Primary Sources Network. It was funded with the federal government funds, and it was the Henry Ford Museum, used to be called Greenfield Village, the University of Michigan, the School of Education, and 2 schools, a charter school that's actually on the campus, on the grounds of the museum, and then a school that butts up against Detroit, Melvindale Allen Park. We started the way we suspect most people, many professional development does, with looking at museum objects. We focused on the museum as a public experience, and I don't know what you know about the Henry Ford or Greenfield Village. Henry Ford was a collector of Americana. He collected all kinds of things, little things, light bulbs, safety pins, big things, locomotives, big things, houses and buildings. So, for example, the Wright Brothers bicycle shop in Dayton was moved from Dayton to Dearborn. Steinmetz's cabin, the head of GE's, his cabin in the Finger Lakes now sits in Dearborn. And one of the houses that we looked at, because we were interested in migration issues, was the Maddox house. This is the way it appears on the grounds of the museum. And what the museum, we started, all our work was simply to teach teachers, in a sense, how to get kids to go through the exhibit. We began to notice some interesting things, though. One of the things was that this is the signage that existed there. It speaks with the kind of definitive certainty that the textbook spoke, and the kids trusted this with the same authority that they trusted the textbook. We already knew the kids came to that with authority. We also followed kids around, and we saw that kids asked lots of questions when visiting the Maddox house. So those are a series of questions that we documented. Unfortunately, unless there was a docent present, those questions didn't get answered, unless one of two things happened. A kid spoke with authority, sometimes making up an answer, and if they spoke with enough authority, the other kids trusted it, or the docent spoke with that kind of authority. Now, something dramatic happened to us in our work with the museum, and this was what it was. One day in doing work, a graduate student at the time, Stephen Muker, and I were looking at this house, which is supposed to represent the way African Americans were living in freeholding in Georgia in the 30s. This is the way it sits on the grounds in the year 2000. That's the way, though, it sat on the grounds when it was dismantled and moved to Dearborn. We stumbled on the picture. Stunning, isn't it? Now, there's an interesting story behind it we discovered, which is that the house on the left was so termite infested that when Mr. Ford had it taken apart and moved to Dearborn, the engineer in Dearborn said, there's no way we're going to put that house on these grounds. So they made a replica of it. Now, when we saw that, all of a sudden we were stunned. So you're not really walking back into the past. It's a representation. Now, as historians, we knew that, right? And all of a sudden it opened up a very different set of conversations. Because now the question was, how did you make decisions? All of a sudden, we became very interested in the decisions that the museum was making for the redesign of this exhibit. We asked these questions. And then we opened them up with the teachers we were working with. We did not treat the house on the left as an uninterpreted event. We opened this whole thing up so that we looked at what the curators were doing in the design of this. And in a sense, what we did is we created an exercise that we use both with kids and with teachers. We call it the virtual curator. We're going to talk a little about it later this afternoon. Its purpose is to unpack what the museum does. It starts with Judy Endelman, former chief curator, who starts with a problem. She says, and it's a true story, Mr. Ford never gave us the inside of this house. We have no idea what the interior was. We're going to ask you to use primary sources to unpack the interior. And they go through primary sources. They go through a series of scaffolds and supports. You speculate on it. You create criteria. We ask the museum, how did you create criteria to determine which source you're going to trust and which one you won't? And so we have both teachers and students create criteria. They create a final design. And then to complete the task, Mrs. Endelman says, and note, we appreciate your insights. We'll consider your ideas as we continue to reinterpret the Maddox house. And hence the exhibit now is seen as a historical account, given the best information one has at the moment. And then the students and the teachers get a chance virtually to interview the curators. So here are two people, Blake Hayes and Nancy Breich, who at the time were the were curators for the Maddox house. They disagree about the interpretation of the house. And you can interview them, in a sense, electronically. So in conclusion, let me make a case to suggest that this is the work of professional development, I would argue. It's the work that takes seriously the problem of teaching and the problem of teachers. And this is where the museum, I think, has a very serious expertise in the representation of historical knowledge and the representation of historical information that they can make visible to teachers and to share an interaction around the problems that are embedded in teaching history. A professional development that would, in a sense, work with teachers, not only deepening their content knowledge, but work specifically on the problems of teaching and learning. And then revisit those based on exactly what happens in the classroom, much like I suspect exhibit designers do when they run mock-ups to see how people respond. And in some ways, the challenges are very similar. I talked about the range of difference in my classroom, often teaching ninth graders and teaching students that had a second or third grade reading level and some that were reading at the graduate level. But on the other hand, they were all in that 13, 14-year-old range. But look at the difference when one walks through the Smithsonian, for example, of the range of people that the exhibit curator must figure out a way to try and engage. How do you do that? What could a teacher learn by unpacking that? In other words, what if we had a James Lipton who sat with the curators at the Smithsonian and said, gosh, how did you do that? How did you know to do that? What designs did you do? What tools? Now, let me conclude by saying that we should harbor absolutely no illusions that this is easy. This idea of making visible that which is invisible is not an easy task. It's going to require, it's messy. It's a lot easier to come in during the summer and deliver content to the teachers and leave. Historical study that asks teachers and students to consider what they know, how they know it, how confidently or tentatively they're entitled to hold their views, how you can construct tools to do this kind of work is very, very difficult. But it's equally important to remember there's incredible joy in this kind of work, working with dedicated teachers, working with kids. Through history, teachers, museum curators, and historians can fill the class with enduring human dramas and dilemmas, grand successes and equally grand tragedies, fascinating mysteries, and an amazing cast of historical characters involved in events that exemplify the very best and the very worst of human experiences. In what other field of study can students and teachers experience such a range of possibilities, get to know so many people and places? Even in this short discussion, in the joys and difficulties of helping teachers improve the quality of instruction, I hope it reveals why it is that the study of history is so crucial and therefore so very worth our efforts. History, historian Peter Stearns has written, should be studied because it's essential to individuals and to society and because it harbors beauty. As scholar of history education, Peter Lee has observed the great value of history education rests in helping students engage in a rational investigation of the past. Since we cannot escape the past, we had better seek the very best knowledge of it we can get. A disciplined study, a disciplined interaction between museum curators and teachers would promote exactly the type of reasoned thought our students deserve, our teachers need, in order for us to have and continue to protect the democratic society we so desperately desire. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Bob. As I was listening to your remarks, I was wishing several times I had a time machine that I could hop in, take a little snippet of your lecture, run back, say, to before 1995 when the state of Maryland created content standards, and replay what you had just said. And in several other instances, I had that thought that I wish we had known now. I wish we could know what we know now. I wish we could take that back and recast some of the things that have been set in concrete about what we do in public education. I am a central office administrator. I have a caveat there. As a central office administrator in a public school system, I do more listening than I do speaking. So I have to give a little, hope you'll beg some indulgence for me that my speaking skills aren't as honed as they used to be when I was a classroom teacher. And as a central office administrator, I'm going to bring a perspective of the school system more than I'm probably going to bring the perspective of the classroom as Bob did. Starting back in 1999, I was the supervisor of social studies for Montgomery County Schools. For 5 years, 3 of those 5 years, I was partnering with the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, SCEMS, on a Teaching American History grant. Since that time, I've expanded a lot of my responsibilities into areas such as advanced placement, international baccalaureate, gifted programs, career and technology education. But I always go back to the time I spent with the Smithsonian as a benchmark for how a partnership can be effective, not just for the 2 partnering institutions, but most effective for the teachers and students who participated. Just in terms of sheer teacher inspiration, the Smithsonian has outshined any other partner I've worked with since then. I'd like to add to Bob's presentation by providing my perspective, and mainly a perspective of central office. I don't claim it's any other person's perspective or any other school system's perspective, but I think some of the things I'm going to mention are things that are common to educators throughout the country. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges facing our school systems, as well as some of our successes. I'm going to follow that with one of the strategies I believe was helpful in making our successes, that is realigning the curriculum. And I'm going to end with the area of professional development, touch on that, and talk about how I feel that that area of professional development is probably the biggest untapped potential that we have in terms of making successful school systems. Bob mentioned throughout his presentation, he enumerated very well the heaps of demands, I think was Bob's phrase, the heaps of demands that teachers have on them today. Those demands expand to school systems. I have kind of summarized them as the 5 S's. Content standards, high stakes, changes in society, changes in students, and a redefinition of success. Let's start with the content standards. These all began back in 1995, 2000, depending on which state you're in. And historians, teachers sat around and created lists of everything students should know and be able to do, starting from pre-kindergarten, usually to 12th grade. If you add up these standards, I'm just going to take my state, Maryland, for example. If you add up these standards and actually talk about the time it takes to teach them, we'd probably have to keep most of our students till about age 25. Parents might like that idea, but it probably wouldn't be such a great benefit for the students. When we look at the standards, they run from the mundane to the expansive. My favorite one is a 5th grade content standard that says, describe the development of the American political system from 1492 to the present. That's one of probably about 30 or 40 content standards for that year. Then let's look about high stakes assessments. I think everyone is aware that since the federal legislation, No Child Left Behind, was passed, that there's been a much greater scrutiny in terms of accountability for school systems. High stakes assessments have narrowed the focus of the curriculum. I think Bob mentioned this in his remarks, that previously the time was pretty much evenly split amongst the disciplines during the instructional day. But if you go down to the elementary level, there's a much greater focus now on reading, language arts, and mathematics, to the exclusion of science, social studies, arts, health, music, and physical education. That's not to say it's not necessary, but that has been a change. Once you get up into the high school, middle school, and high school, the change is not as exasperated. We also have seen huge changes in society. In fact, public schools have become the favorite errand boy for every ill that befalls our society. The Maryland legislature just wrapped up its work the end of April, and during its last term, they had 3 or 4 bills that would give specific directions to school systems about initiatives they would need to add. Initiatives, by the way, that weren't funded. There was a demand that there be additional time for physical education. There was a demand that there be additional time for financial literacy. There was a demand for additional senior year options and a demand for environmental education. All of these are very important issues. However, none of them came with additional time during the school day to teach them. So what was once a demand, say in 1950, of what the basics were expected, has more than tripled in terms of what's expected during the same instructional day. Then let's look at our students. Students have a lot more going on in their lives today than they did 10 years ago. And the gap between the most prepared and the least prepared coming into our schools is expanded. I'm going to talk about this in just a minute. And then let's talk about success. NCLB changed what the definition of success is in the United States. We used to say it's okay to have two systems. One system where a certain group of kids goes on a track and is highly prepared, and another system where kids fall off the radar and aren't so well prepared. We've changed that. Now we're defining success as all students must have success, and it must be measurable success, thus the high-stakes assessments. I'm going to use a demographic chart from my school district to illustrate some of this. If you go back to 1970, we were a predominantly white, affluent suburban district. If you look at 1970, you see the top of the baby boom there at about 130,000, 125,000 students. And if you go to today, we're now up to about 137,000 students. Makes us the 16th largest school district in the United States. Fairfax County in Virginia is about 167,000, so they're an even larger school district. The change in demographics is really telling, because this is going to be the change in demographics we can expect to see in all public education institutions in the next 50 years. This is not something that's just going to be limited to metropolitan areas or large urban suburban school districts like our own. This has pointed to us. The clarion call for NCLB is not just a federal mandate. It's clear this is going to be our next generation that's going to take care of us, and that making sure that all students are prepared is very important. However, the demographics are also changing in other areas. Let's look at poverty. We know that poverty has probably the most corrosive impact on education of all the outside forces. In 2003, Betty Hart and Todd Risley estimated that the gap between children of affluent families and children of families receiving government assistance was high as 30 million words heard at home by the time a kid reaches age 3. This is a huge preparedness gap. This impacts formal education, certainly, but it also impacts informal education settings. If you look at Montgomery County schools, that large number of students we've added over the last 3 years, over the last 30 years, 20,000 of those students were high poverty students. This free and reduced meals program is the marker that most public school systems use as an indication of poverty. It's a voluntary system where students and their families apply for free and reduced meals. How about language? We have more and more students coming in who need language support. We've added over 15,000 students in need of English as a secondary language service since 1990. The majority of these students are, in this graph, are seen at the elementary level because typically these students graduate out of ESOL services. It doesn't mean they're on a par with their peers, but they graduate out of ESOL services in 3 years. Most of the students are required, by the way, to take the NCLB required assessments within a year of arriving. It would be the equivalent of you or I going to China and taking a Chinese language exam and having that count for whether or not our school is successful. If you were to ask to predict what this school district's achievements were, I'm going to ask you to stop for a minute. If you were to predict what our school district's achievements were over the last 30 years, the response that most people say, given these demographic changes, is that our assessment scores were probably flat or more likely had declined. that people would say, well, that's an expectation. If we look at the tradition of public education in the United States, once demographics change in a large school system, the achievement begins to change. We were very fortunate that in 1999 we had a new superintendent who came in and said, I'm going to ask you to bend that trend. I'm going to ask you to break that trend. I'm going to say, instead of lowering expectations as our demographics change, we're going to raise the expectations. And we were asked to basically come up with a new model for how we approach this problem. This is probably the simplest way to express what is a very complex strategic plan. Instead of shooting for the state level curriculum, we rewrote our curriculum and its accompanying professional development to focus on college ready and work ready for all students. One of the drawbacks of the NCLB program has been that each state has created its own set of standards. So basically we have 50 different sets of standards, and they vary in quality, quite frankly. Some of them are very challenging, others are okay. Assessments also vary greatly. Bob mentioned that his district, Ohio was one of the school systems that had document-based questions. In fact, very few states actually assess history at all. So trying to find some sort of measure that is a high-stakes measure has been very challenging for us. We chose instead to go with two outside measures. One is the advanced placement measure developed by the College Board, and the other is the International Baccalaureate measure, which is developed by the International Baccalaureate Organization, which is in Switzerland. We took their standards that they had for high school students and we back mapped them all the way into the elementary level. What does this look like? Well, it means that you're getting more of your historical thinking skills that Bob was speaking about. You're asking, can students marshal evidence to create an argument? You're asking for interpretive analysis. You're asking for attribution of sourcing. You're basically training students to become much more skeptical in their thinking and in their development, rather than just looking at, can I amass a certain amount of content and regurgitate it back on a multiple choice test. We also, if you see the equation at the top, we looked very closely at this idea of taking access and equity and rigor to get to success. By access, we mean that we took down all barriers for whether or not students could get in higher level courses. It used to be in most school systems, it still is, to get into an AP course, for instance, you'd have to have a teacher recommendation. You would have to have a certain GPA. We took those barriers down. We did that all the way back into elementary school because we saw gatekeeping as early as second grade, when decisions were made about whether or not a student was gifted would determine where they would end up in 11th and 12th grade. At the same time, we felt it was really important to improve the equity by doing differentiation training and by basically providing more professional development. I have to admit, this is an area that we certainly don't feel like that we've hit the end of the road, so to speak, in terms of being supportive for teachers there. And then we looked at rigor. That was the idea of back mapping all the way back. We put those three together, and we've begun to see some success 10 years later. Take a look at our kindergarten scores here. This is the number of students who are reading at a 3 or better, which is a text level. That means they can read a simple sentence by the end of kindergarten. In 2002, about 55% of our students could read a simple sentence by the end of kindergarten. In 2007, 93% could read a simple sentence by the end of kindergarten. We also narrowed the range, with Asian students to African American students being close to 30 points in 2002, and in 2007 it being closer to 10 points. This was done by the amazing work of amazing teachers. These were people who took this as a very serious job. How do we make students learn to read? It was also done by expanding time for instruction. Kindergarten instruction during this time period doubled. We used to have half-day kindergarten across the district. Now we have full-day kindergarten across the district. it's made a phenomenal difference. Let's look at the other end. How about advanced placement? 60% of students in Montgomery County schools take one or more AP exam by the time they're seniors. The national average, you'll see it there in the little box, is 24% or 25% of students take one or more AP exam. If we look at our African American students, about 34% take one or more AP exam and 47% take one or more AP exams. While this does make us a tall tree in a short forest, it still is a huge gap between what the white and Asian students are doing in terms of AP exams and what African American and Hispanic students are doing. Let's take a look at not just taking exams, how are they doing? How are they scoring? We had a lot of people said, well, when you start down this road, if you just start letting anybody in these courses, you're going to have a watering down of the curriculum, have a watering down of the content, you'll have a watering down of achievement. Well, in fact, now having more than half of the class, we've now had almost half the class of 2007 score well enough to get college credit on at least one exam. That's 3 times the national average. We've tripled the number of tests taken and the number of students taking tests since 1999, and we've managed to maintain an average score of 3.4. Now, the average score in 1999 was 3.7. So we have decreased somewhat, but we've opened up the opportunity tremendously. You couldn't have these results if you dumbed down the curriculum. Back mapping was essential to this. What does that look like? I don't have the time to get into it in extensive detail, but to give you a suggestion or an example, starting back in 1999 when we were working with the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, we were in the process of taking these skills back into our curriculum. We also had another problem. We had the time problem. Bob mentioned the problems of pacing. You have all this content and you need to get it done in a certain amount of time. We used to have 5 units in 6 units and 5 units in 4th grade and 6 units in 5th grade of instruction. We combined the 2 years so that Maryland history wasn't taught separate from U.S. history. That's a standard practice in education across the country. And we reduced the number of units. So we have 3 units in 4th grade, 3 units in 5th grade. That gave us the opportunity to put more of these types of skills in, historical thinking skills, attribution, marshaling evidence, document analysis, reconstructing a narrative, determining reliability of sources. We were able to actually write into the curriculum. For instance, I'm sure you all have seen this before. This is the Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre. We put this in as a historical investigation in the curriculum, where students had to answer the question, who was more to blame for the deaths at the Boston Massacre, the British soldiers or the Boston colonists? When students first look at this, they look very closely, and once they figure out who is who, that the redcoats are the British and the people lying on the ground being shot to death are the colonists, they make the conclusion that, in fact, the British were more to blame at the Boston Massacre. And as I heard one student once said, clearly the British were guilty because they were shooting at a dog. However, we then give them a little bit of information to make things confusing. Here's an engraving of the same site by Henry Pelham. And again, the same question. The students have to come back, and they begin to look now, and they see Crispus Attucks being shot there. He has a club in his hand. And then you see a patriot in blue with a club in his hand. And if you could blow up the far left, you could see that the crowd back there has clubs in their hands, that maybe they weren't exactly a quiet protesting group. Maybe there was a little bit of confusion about who was most responsible. And this is when we introduce something that really gets the students confused, and it gets into this idea of sourcing and attribution in chronological order. We ask the students to put these in chronological order. This happens to be something that's very confusing because the Pelham print that you see here was actually developed first but was published second. So Paul Revere based his off of Pelham's, but Paul Revere got his out first, and so which do you say is first? That kind of creates a problem for students. We've seen teachers do wonders with this. They then take 4 or 5 additional sources, and then the students in some schools have created mock trials where they put the British soldiers on trial and they represented different points of view. So while we're not doing a full document-based question like you would see at high school, we're beginning to inculcate the belief and the understanding that history is an investigation. History is an argument based on evidence. That beginning very early has helped us when we move into middle school and we have students doing more of this. If we had just done this in our curriculum, it certainly wouldn't have been enough. And this is where we were very fortunate to have the Smithsonian come to our aid in a Teaching American History grant. Bob mentioned that the TAH has been a godsend. I'd like to echo that. If I could say it more strongly, I would. We would have had no professional development for this curriculum if it were not for the Teaching American History grant. Why? School systems do not afford professional development for areas like social studies, art, health, PE. Most professional development in school systems is spent on the areas that are being directly assessed. This is understandable, but it does create a problem for us in these areas. If it hadn't been for the Teaching American History grant, certainly teachers who participated would have said they wouldn't have even tried some of these historical investigations. When we'd begun doing the research, we found that less than 10% of elementary teachers have any substantial coursework in American history. Most elementary school teachers only need to have 2 courses in the social sciences to get a teaching certificate, and the most common course they take is sociology. In effect, most elementary teachers haven't had a history course since high school. This is a critical need area for us. We are fortunate that when we went to the program with the Smithsonian, they were very open. Smithsonian said, well, how would you like to work this? We would like to have some of our content specialists present some of their information, and we would like to be able to see how that would work back in the classroom. And again, this is one of those times where I'd like to take the time machine back from Bob's comments and say, wow, this is exactly how we could have done it. But we felt our way through, and what we ended up doing was the curators were presenting more of their thinking about what they were doing, not to the studied approach that Bob has suggested, but they were beginning to unpack some of their thinking about how they put exhibits together and how they do their work. I think the biggest effect, certainly, for me, was to see the inspiration teachers took away from learning more about the content. We are very fortunate that the TAH grant also had an evaluation that went with it. Previously, there had been no evaluation components for professional development in social studies. We basically had what you'd call a sit and get or drive-by approach to professional development. And the surveys done afterward were kind of like, how did you like the weather? Was it too hot or too cold? We were very fortunate to have an evaluator from the nearby University of Maryland College Park, Bruce Van Sledright. I think he's here today and is going to be speaking in more detail on some of this afternoon. He did a very thorough assessment. It was called the HICTAB. It included a written assessment, a document-based question for the teachers. And in fact, the teachers began to say when they took it they were HICTABed because it was such a challenging assessment. What did they learn from it? What did we learn from it? Professional and general interest in history significantly improved for the teachers who participated. The knowledge of the work of history professionals improved. Their capacity to write document-based interpretive essays improved. Substantive knowledge growth, however, was variable. We didn't see great strides in substantive knowledge growth. When we look at what happened in the specific teacher case study observations, Bruce's team followed around a group of teachers into the classroom afterwards. He found that they had changed their understandings of history and they had a much greater understanding of history. Most important to us, they had a great confidence in using the curriculum now, and they showed a greater interest in the historical investigations. They also showed that they were still dealing with the challenges that Bob mentioned. They didn't have enough time still to teach history. overall, they were able to better teach history, but they were still dealing with the issues of history. What we did find interesting is those who had a little bit of knowledge to begin with grew much farther, or they reported growing much farther in their daily teaching practice from where they began. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that what you do as museum curators helps us immeasurably. When you can make the invisible visible, it does wonders for teachers. It begins them thinking that teaching and learning is not just a resuscitation of fact, but it is, as Bob has said, an active pursuit, an enduring problem that really begins to shape how they think and how they act as teachers. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank Bob and Marty both. Learned so much today, even though I was part of Marty's program, and hearing from Bob, I'm going to take a lot of this into our future work, so thank you both. We're going to open this to questions now. We have about 15 or 20 minutes. If you please go to the microphones on either side of the auditorium here if you have a question. And Bob, would you come on up? Could you please introduce yourself, say who you are, and who you're addressing the question to?
What does that mean, and what implications does that have for the grants themselves?
So my take on that is that the traditional American history does not, though lots of people think it means a kind of conservative, name dates, etc. I don't think it means that at all. One of the things that, the grants are often called Byrd grants, in part because Senator Byrd was instrumental in them. In Senator Byrd's speech on the floor of the Senate to support the grants, he gave a long and eloquent argument about a time when history was separated from the social studies, when teachers were trained in history. And so I think a good part of that has to do with a kind of traditional history separate and removed. In fact, the legislation says that it's a separate, in almost in a sense, a standalone. So I think that's what it means by the traditional. It means history that's apart or removed from social studies. I also think that it's a bit of a press on schools of education as well. The concern that much or too much of the training of teachers is left to schools of ed, something that this historian, whose appointment is in the School of Ed, disagrees with. But I think that's part of what it means.
Hello, my name is Jeff Mead. I'm the school and tour coordinator at the Postal Museum, and this is also a question for Mr. Brown, or Mr. Bain, I'm sorry. You had said that classrooms are historical events,
Yeah.
and I think that's very interesting. And to me, it's a really good example of something I experience just about every time that I get a field trip in, because it's not a class of my own. It's someone else's class that's coming to visit me for 1 hour. So it's a very particular moment in time. And something that I've been struggling with is how much effort do I need to make trying to figure out what these students are already capable of and what they already know coming into me, so that I can use that to my advantage and build lesson plans based around those ideas. I'm just curious to know how important you think that might be and how best I might be able to do that.
Well, being able to anticipate where the audience, where the students are, is, I think, critical. Being able to be flexible, I think, is equally critical. one of the problems that we see often with novice teachers is they have very little backlog, very little, in a sense, prior knowledge that they can use in anticipating those sets of experiences. So we think it's critical. It's absolutely critical. I suspect curators and museum designers are very mindful of the kind of background knowledge people bring in and ways that you would have to engage them. One of the things that in some of the work that people have been doing, we've been doing a lot of this, is trying to figure out what kind of discrepant information we might give very quickly that might engage students' thinking. A small example of it in some work, we've taken the idea that most students in this country think that that when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, the world was flat. Everyone thought the world was flat. And one of the things that one can do by engaging in discrepant information is simply show them a statue of, for example, a Greek statue that shows Atlas holding a globe. Now you've got a very bit of interesting information there, don't you? If we've assumed that the world was in point of flat, for people in the time thought that, then what does the fact that the Greek myth had Atlas holding up a globe, or the fact that Erasthenes had calculated the circumference of the globe? So you've got a very interesting problem, and that kind of information surfaces all kinds of things with learners. But the long-winded way to say that it's absolutely critical, we think, to be able to identify the kinds of understandings that students bring with you. Now, by the way, I've been fortunate in the sense that I've I guess, come of professional age in a time when people have taken that kind of work very seriously. So, for example, I mentioned Sam Weinberg's work. Bruce Van Sludright, who's in the back, is another person who's done a robust work in studying the way kids think in the context of doing history. So Bruce's work in studying 5th and 6th graders thinking around these same sets of documents that, in fact, Weinberg did with high school kids illuminates the kind of thinking one might begin to expect. Keith Barton has done similar work. Linda Levstick. There's a variety. Peter Lee in Great Britain. There's a group of people that have been looking at kids thinking or adult thinking in engaging in history that would give one, in a sense, a way to begin to think about these sets of things as an anticipation. R.G. Collingwood once described the function of history as kind of like walking through the woods with a trained woodsman. That what the historian does is it helps you learn to see better in the context within which you work. It doesn't mean that there's going to be the lion, lurking in the woods, or it doesn't mean that the lion will jump, but it does mean that the historian can help you see in the context within which you're going to act. In a sense, the work that people like Bruce or people like Sam Weinberg have been doing, I think, help those of us that are engaged in education learn to see a little bit clearer in the context within which we must act.
My name is Glenn Williamson, and I'm an art historian, not an historian, but I run a graduate program in museum studies at the University of Florida. And I think my question is for Marty Creel. I wanted to know if there were any specifics about the kinds of interaction that you had with the Smithsonian and how it affected specifically some form of pedagogy in the teaching of history. I mean, I can imagine that knowing the way that exhibitions were put together would be fascinating, and the kinds of questions that were asked. But are there any examples that you can give us of how that happened? And lastly, if I can also ask, and this may be for both of you, is there any kind of toolkit for those teachers who might be in a metropolitan or even a county area whose resources aren't quite as rich as the Smithsonian, where they could address, that they could use in their local historical society?
Bob's going to address the second part of your question. In terms of what was it that we did with the Smithsonian that really provided us the ability to work well with curators, a lot of it was quite simply a long planning time ahead of the actual events, where we sat out and planned very specifically what the issues that we wanted to attend to were. Instead of thinking of each other as independent operators where we needed this and then you fill in this kind of little contractual area and then we do this separately. We really looked and sat down and planned the whole experience together. So for us, from Montgomery County perspective, was the opportunity to feel like we were on equal partnership footing with the partnering institution. And that we sat down and had multiple planning meetings long in advance. I think Stevie might be able to speak to it from the Smithsonian perspective, but what impressed me from working with SCEMS is as we worked and identified some of the areas that we needed support in, we would take a few weeks in between meetings and they would identify all the areas they felt that they could basically provide that support. And we would get back together again and we would go through each one. So we took a very long, planful approach to it. I think that was key. Bob, you're going to talk about...
Can I ask
Sure.
you, is there any specific?
The one that comes back to me time and again is the, I hope I get the name correct, the Within These Walls exhibit that used to be at the American History Museum. I don't know if it's going to be there when it reopens, but it was, it will be there? Okay. It was essentially a building that had been moved in full to the Smithsonian, and it basically had the ability where teachers could walk around through it and develop a chronological understanding of American history. That for us was very important because we knew we were dealing with teachers who sometimes, frankly, didn't have a full picture, if you will, of the chronological development of American history. And we were able to use that one exhibit as an introduction not only to looking at exhibits and taking them apart and how were they developed, but also develop the chronological understanding that is foundational to moving a little bit farther on. So I think for us it was identifying our need, and for the Smithsonian it was saying, well, here we have the perfect fit.
One quick follow-up to that. When Marty showed the two pictures of the Boston Massacre, that struck me as a perfect example of this idea of juxtaposition. That one puts sources right next to each other that force communication, force conversation. That in a sense that's the kind of toolkit that would automatically engage you because you've got this discrepant information right in front of you. The second thing that struck me, but just what he just said right now, was this, again, this very interesting idea about situating things in time. Very difficult. Thinking historically requires us to situate things along multiple schemes of time. And it's very, very complicated. In a classroom, a kid has a very difficult time, so do we as adults, thinking about events that happen simultaneously. Simultaneity is a very complicated problem. So the fact that a museum may help by creating symbols that show events happening simultaneously, and that ways in which those things might support student thinking in the classroom might be particularly productive. The other question about toolboxes, one of the things that is on the horizon is a clearinghouse for history education. It was recently funded by the federal government. It's just begun. It's housed at Stanford University. There are people working on it all across the country. There have begun to be a series of white papers, issues that have begun to be defined. For example, there's one note, the question about teaching American history as traditional American history. Note it doesn't say world history. And so there are some people that are very concerned about the fact that that in this time American kids should know more about the world, so why isn't there a Teaching American History grant for teaching world history? So there's an issue paper that raises those sets of questions. One of the things that we hope is that out of this clearinghouse will be, in a sense, the very best things that come out of the Teaching American History grants, so there'll be a residue for just the things that you talked about, so that some of the toolboxes, some of the things that do seem to be successful, that work. The reports that came out of Montgomery County from the evaluation that I looked in terms of its influence on teacher thinking and teacher knowledge is heartening. it'd be useful to find out exactly what people at the Smithsonian did in order to replicate it. One hopes that those kinds of studies now become available to Clearinghouse. Up until this point, that hasn't been the case. So in some ways, we were every year reinventing the wheel. So the hope is that, in point of fact, these things will happen.
I was going to just add to this just briefly. I see the stop sign there. I think I have a couple of minutes. Just from the Smithsonian point of view, that I see several people in the audience here who participated in that grant along with our office. So it really was a pan-institutional effort. And from our point of view, I think that the really valuable thing for us was really sitting down with the evaluator, with Bruce and with Marty and with the project director from the school district side, and we had really literally weekly meetings. The school district's curriculum was being revised and rewritten at that time, so we read the, in our office, I as project director for it, read the curriculum. We had meetings with everyone we had identified as the Smithsonian presenters, and so we were really building this institute together. Then luckily, because we had Bruce with us, we were able, after the first cohort of teachers, to go back and say, well, what worked and what didn't work, and to go back and revise and hone. So it was a very exciting experience for all of us. And I think that would be, in my mind, that would be the linchpin of the whole thing, was the really careful planning. The second part, just briefly, is that we had the school district identified master teachers. And so the teachers would sit through each session, and we would have, for each day, we would have not just a content focus, but also a process focus question that the teachers were to keep in mind. And the debrief and the monitoring of this was done by the master teachers. So they would debrief the teachers on the readings they had done the night before. They would lead discussions about what the classroom applications were for what was being done during the sessions. And one quick example of that is that we had a session with Dr. Doug Owsley, who's a world-renowned forensic anthropologist, and the teachers would really enjoy putting together the skeleton and trying to find out what it was that they could learn from what happened, what happened in this settlement, this colonial settlement. But then the master teachers would go back afterwards and say, well, we realize you all don't have skeletons in the classroom, but what can you learn from the way Dr. Owsley went through giving you clues? What can you learn about how that story was pieced together and told to make it so engaging and interesting for you, and something similar would be for your students? So those are just two quick examples.
Can I have one quick thing? Real quickly, one of the things that's, again, really heartening about that is the feedback loop. So in a sense, that typical model professional development, which stops at the classroom door, clearly the project in Montgomery County and here at the Smithsonian violates that typical norm to their benefit. So there's a feedback loop, so that the evaluator is giving information back to the people, or apparently sitting at the same table with them. That's very, very rare. Most often, again, it's what you call it, the drive-by professional development. The other thing that's really heartening, in maybe in some ways the next bit of work that we need to constantly do, is that if we consider that the teachers in the professional development is in a sense one audience, we want to see what effect it's beginning to have on them. But of course the next step is what effect is it having on the students, and what kind of information does knowledge of the student growth have on what happens both to the teachers and then to what we do in professional development. That seems to me like almost completing the cycle. Those are rare. Very rarely are we actually following that, and that's always been the case. In a study done by David Cohen and Heather Hill, a pretty substantive study of math professional development in a book called Learning Policy, they demonstrated that professional development that had three features. One was it was not episodic, that teachers stay in a sustained 2 or 3 year study. Secondly, that it was deepening teachers' content knowledge about the things that they teach, but not just keeping a chapter ahead of the textbook, but for example, if they're teaching fractions, it's deepening their understanding of fractions such that they're developing a pretty sophisticated notion of it. And third and critical is that the object of inquiry of the teacher is student work, that they're studying what the students are doing. so that in some ways the professional developers are studying what the teachers are doing, but then the next step is part of the professional development activity is that they're actually studying what's going on in their classroom, in their students. That becomes part of professional development. What Cohn and Hill found was that that was a critical component in student performance on mathematics assessments. There's very little of that that's been done in history education, but there are some, again, the large math studies have shown something that might suggest that that's a pretty critical component.
Okay, I think we have to end now. This has been thank you very much for your questions. It's been a very interesting discussion. I want to thank again Bob and Marty. Please give them another round of applause. Okay, thank you.